and why we like them. And like any church also, for example, if you were a Catholic in the Catholic Church, you'll realize many people, unfortunately, hate the Catholic Church, right? Communists hate the Catholic Church. Socialists hate the Catholic Church. Many people hate the Catholic Church. Is the Catholic Church bad? No. Do you know one thing about the Catholic Church? We're not Catholics, we're Protestants. But the Catholic Church sponsors more hospitals for poor people in the world than any nation on earth. As a church, they support more hospitals for poor people than any country in the world. Did you know that? Yeah. And nevertheless, many people still hate the Catholic Church. Not me. I'm not a Catholic, but I still respect them for the good work they do. And also, by the way, if you hang around with us, you realize some people persecute our church too. You may find some persecution of our church. Don't worry. It's not because we did anything bad. In fact, you shall see from this why not. So this is from, Mrs. Moon's name is really Hak Jahan. In Korea, when women get married, they don't take their husband's name. They keep their own name. I'm Hak Jahan. So her name is Hak Jahan. This is what she writes about motherhood. She's a good mother. She has 14 children. Mrs. Moon has 50 grandchildren. Wow. Can you imagine that? 50 grandchildren. Anyhow, she says this, "Mommy, my stomach hurts. When a child complains of a stomach ache, his mother lays him on her lap and rubs his tummy without a single word. Her hands may be gnarled and rough, but in a few moments the child feels better. This may be a simple approach, but it is the proactive of true love. As we know from our own experience, a mother hears her child's cry very clearly and has no thought but to quickly run to her child. This is because a mother's love and attention are directed solely to her children." That's what she feels about motherhood. Don't we? Right? There's some military people in here. Here's an interesting thing. I don't know if you really want to hear this or not. But corpsmen, my son is a corpsman in the Marine Corps, corpsmen and medical doctors in the Army say, many times when young men are dying from wounds in war, many times, all they call out for is their mother. Isn't that interesting? Mother. I want to talk to my mother. Somebody please tell my mother I love her. Many men's last words are, "I love you, mother." So motherhood is very, very important to us, and it is to Mrs. Moon. So I'm going to read some of Mrs. Moon's early history and why she's so passionate about world peace. Right? She says, "As for me, I was born in the midst of a world consumed by chaos, in which no light of hope was to be seen. The Second World War, set in motion in the autumn of 1939, was growing ever more intense. German fascism and Japanese imperialism were staining Europe and Asia with blood. With the exception of Britain, most nations in Europe had been trampled by Hitler, and even Britain was suffering constant air raids from Nazi Germany." Mrs. Boone was born in 1943, in the middle of World War II, in the middle of a country dominated by Japanese imperialists. So she grew up in that era. She says, "The plight of Korea, a Japanese colony, was just as wretched. My warm childhood experiences notwithstanding, Koreans endured a tremendous struggle just to survive and to find food to eat and clothes to wear. As the end of the war approached, Japanese soldiers raided Korean homes and confiscated everything metal, even the brassware used in ancestral rites to create weapons. All rice went to feed Japanese soldiers, with the Korean people left to starve. Farmers who had harvested rice with their own hands did not get to eat even a morsel of that rice. Japan went as far as to ban the use of Hangul, the Korean alphabet that encompasses the spirit of its people, and forced us to throw away our Korean names and adopt Japanese names. All young Korean men were drafted either to fight on battlefields far from home or to work long hours in coal mines and factories. Most people don't know, many times during the wars, Americans fought Korean men. They didn't know they were Korean men. They were drafted by the Japanese and forced to fight for Japan. Korea, under Japanese rule, military control. Japan set up a government in Korea with the governorship filled by generals or admirals appointed by the Japanese emperor. The Koreans were deprived of freedom of assembly, association, the press, and speech. Many private schools were closed because they did not meet certain arbitrary standards. The colonial authorities used their own school system as a tool for assimilating Korea to Japan. placing primary emphasis on teaching the Japanese language and excluding from the educational curriculum such subjects as Korean language and Korean history. The Japanese built nationwide transportation and communications networks and established a new monetary and financial system. They also promoted Japanese commerce in Korea while barring Koreans from the same activities, right? So Koreans were poor, they were mistreated. This was a racial issue between Japanese and Koreans. Japanese thought they're the master race, and Koreans are the subservient servant or slave race. So that's what Reverend Mrs. Moon grew up in. Reverend Moon was born in 1920, grew throughout. His uncles were tortured. You'll read in a few minutes. Mrs. Moon's mother and grandmother were imprisoned by them. So she continues, ready to lay down the life for the sake of the nation's right to exist. That is, the March 1st independent demonstrations took place not only in Anju, they occurred simultaneously in Seoul and across the nation. This was in 19. No, there were several of them. This is one that Mother's mother attended, and the Koreans tried to make a rally for independence from Japan in 1933, I believe it was. At most sites, they included a public reading of the Korean Declaration of Independence. This public outcry was not feudal symbolism. It was an act of peaceful, nonviolent protest, an acclamation that Korean people will cherish for eternity. Remember, Americans made a Declaration of Independence to England, and then what happened? England tried to kill them all. Same thing happened to the Korean people. Within moments, the demonstrators' ears were assaulted by the sound of whistles and boots. With batons and rifles, dozens of policemen converged upon the market. They mercilessly struck everyone in their path, right and left. People were beaten to the ground, bloodied. The policemen did not distinguish between man or woman, young or old. Desperate to protect her daughter, this mother had no choice but to hold back her tears and retreat. That's Mother's mother, by the way. That's her grandmother. That's who she's talking about when she said this was there. Although she was filled with resolve to stand to the last, she knew God's wishes for the human fellowship and that bloodshed would only increase the burden of pain in God's heart. So she escaped. The March 1st movement. Oh, it is 1919. A turning point in Korea's resistance movement came on March 1st, 1919, when nationwide anti-Japanese rallies were staged. The former Emperor Kajang, the supreme symbol of independence, had died a few weeks earlier, bringing mourners from all parts of the country to the capital for his funeral. A Korean Declaration of Independence was read at a rally in Seoul on March 1st. That's one of the reasons I'm reading this, because this is March. We're remembering March 1st. Waves of students and citizens took to the streets, demanding independence. An estimated 2 million people took part. The March 1st movement, as it came to be known, took the form of peaceful demonstrations appealing to the conscience of the Japanese. The Japanese, however, responded with brutal repression, unleashing their gendarmerie and army and navy units to suppress the demonstrations. They arrested some 47,000 Koreans, of whom about 10,500 were indicted, while some 7,500 were killed and 16,000 wounded. So this is what Mother's growing up in, right? That's why we call Mrs. Moon Mother Moon, by the way. So she's growing up with this incredible, painful, suffering experience. Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon came to understand evil, extreme racism as her family and her countrymen were tyrannized by Japan. Based upon her experiences, she realizes racism is a horror around the world and has been working to erase this evil. That's why, for example, in our church, we have usually every color of every imagination of humans on earth, right? We like that. We want to be an international church. We do not want to be just a white church or a brown church or a black. We want to be an every human being church. And that's one of the things that we do. And many people don't like that. This is her prayer. Now, you're true to God. You know, your true sons and daughters who share my passion are appearing. Our skin colors are irrelevant. I have filial children with black skin, yellow skin, and white skin, sons who are Muslim leaders and daughters who lead large Christian churches. I have sons and daughters who lead nations. All of these mother-child ties come about in your name, God's name. My children ask me to bless their nations and religions. Before them and their peoples, I talk about you, our heavenly parent. I talk about Heavenly Mother, hidden behind Heavenly Father, and explain if there's only an only begotten Son, there's also an only begotten daughter of God. So we believe God has a feminine side as well as a masculine side. So when she says this, she started a group called Women's Federation for World Peace that seeks to raise up women's position in countries and politics and business and education so that women stand equal to men throughout the whole world. It was very important to her that women now, so we understand, right? In the Roman world, Romans enslaved everybody. After that, people enslaved all kinds of people. But in the 20th century, in the 19th century, slavery ended in the West. We realized, no, it's wrong to enslave people. We realized that's wrong. You can't do that anymore. So we don't enslave anybody anymore. Likewise, we believe in the 21st century, people should realize women are equal to men in every capacity. Men are stronger, but women are just as smart, right? Sometimes smarter. Right, honey? Right, sweetheart? My wife is here. Sometimes they're smarter. Yes. Thank you. So this is an important part of this. Reverend Mrs. Moon, try every aspect to overcome racism. Again, in our church, we have all races combined. We have interracial marriages. We do that. We love to do that, right? Why? Because we realize Japanese racists were wrong. Racism is wrong. Thinking another group, you're prejudiced against another group because of their color or their nation or their cultural status, we think that's wrong. Everybody are children of God. Everyone has a chance to grow to their full potential and stand as a true son or daughter of God. That's what we believe, right? So all people have the potential to be great. South Korea went from the poorest nation, right? Japanese thought Korea is the poorest nation on earth. We should make them slaves. But it went from the poorest nation to one of the richest nations because the Japanese view of Koreans was completely wrong. Let me read this part. Okay, this is after the Korean War. General MacArthur was a commander of the UN forces in Korea. Among his forces were around 150,000 soldiers. These were mostly made up of members of the U.S. 8th Army. Also counted with them were attached military units from Australia, South Korea, Thailand, the United Kingdom, all coming together to defend South Korea's capital. Confronting him, General Peng Dehuai commanded the Chinese 13th Army and was entrusted with the task of capturing Seoul. The miracle on the Han River. So this is after the coup. The miracle on the Han River refers to the period of rapid economic growth in South Korea following the Korean War, during which South Korea transformed from a least developed country to one of the most developed countries ever. The rapid reconstruction and development of South Korean economy during the latter half of the 20th century was accompanied by events such as the country's successful hosting of the 1988 Summer Olympics and its co-hosting of the 2002 FIFA World Cup, as well as the ascension of family-owned conglomerates known as chaebols such as Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. I own a Samsung telephone. Right? Does anybody drive a Hyundai car? It's okay if you do because they became world leaders in automobile manufacture. Watch this. So this is left. This is 1951. This is downtown Korea in 1951. Right? This is downtown Korea now. Next picture. Okay. Next picture. This is downtown Korea now, right? One of the gorgeous, beautiful, and by the way, safest cities that you could ever be in. Let me go back and read this. This growth also encompassed declines in child mortality and increases in life expectancy. From 1961 to 1971, child mortality declined by 59%, the second fastest decrease in child mortality of any country with over 10 million inhabitants during the same period. South Korea during this period has been described as corporatist or as practicing state capitalism. This period of growth was overseen by the Democratic Republican Party. See, we have Democrats and Republicans. They have Democratic Republicans. A conservative, broadly stated state capitalist national system. So this is very important to me. North Korea became Marxist communist is still the poorest country in the world. They're poorer than any South American country. They're actually still in starvation due to Marxism. The South became a capitalist country, and they're the 7th richest country in the entire world, and there's only 50 million Koreans. They compete with Japan, they compete with Germany, they compete with England, and there's only 50 million Koreans, but they're very, very wealthy, which is nice. It's nice to have food on the table. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. Following the miracle on the Han River, South Korea has been held as an economic model for other developing countries and is seeded to the G20 in November 2010. That means the top 20 countries in the entire world, right? Capping a successful 60-some years of rebuilding and modernization. I like Korea. Anybody here been to Korea? Yeah. Few people. Korea's a great country. People are the nicest people in the world. They always invite you in and ask you to eat too much. Koreans never ask you to just have a little bit, right? You know, like when we went to Japan, like they give me like a little dish like this. And wonder why it wasn't full. But in Korea, they're not like that. They say, eat more, eat more. No, eat more. No, I'm full now. Eat more. They're just generous people. So I love Koreans. So let's continue. This is Mrs. Moon. Okay, in 1948, after World War II ended, when the oppression of religions by she was born in North Korea, not South Korea. So in North Korea, they were a strong Christian church. Actually, probably the most Christian nation at the time, right? Even more so than the United States. Korea really loved Christianity. But after 48, when the communists took over, the oppression of the religions by North Korea's Communist Party was at its height. My mother and grandmother were imprisoned for nearly 2 weeks for being members of the Inside Womb Christian Church, as a prophetic Pentecostal church. I was 5 years old at the time, and I would go to the prison to see my mother. So Reverend Mrs. Moon are very anti-communist. And you'll read some of the things they do. Why? Because her mother and grandmother were put in prison by the communists. The leader of their church was tortured to death by the communists. So when you see the Unification Church is very, very strong about certain aspects, about freedom for countries, freedom and peace. This is why, because they grew up under this incredible suffering course. Right? It was autumn of 1948 when we left our home in the middle of the night. My mother carrying me on her back and my grandmother carrying a couple of bundles. It is quite a distance from Anju to the 38th parallel, 200 kilometers, 125 miles as the crow flies. So two ladies carrying a 5-year-old girl on their back, trying to get to the 38th parallel to the south, to freedom, right? We had to walk for days and days to cover that distance, and we took every step on that journey with anxiety, fearing for our lives. At night we slept in empty houses, and when the morning dew fell, we would start again. Our shoes were flimsy, and the roads were rough, and so our feet ached from the very start. What was hardest to endure was the hunger. We would knock on the doors of shabby cottages and give them something from our bundles in exchange for food, which was usually a cup of boiled barley and rice. Undergoing such hardships, we walked and walked endlessly southward. Can you imagine that? No, people in America generally can't imagine starving, walking, communist police chasing you, looking for you, and you're just trying to get to freedom. Unfortunately, they were caught. North Korean People's Army soldiers were blocking the 38th parallel, and they easily captured my mother, grandmother, and me. They locked us up in a shed together with other frightened people who had the same intention as us. The soldiers were rough with the men, but they did not treat the women and children harshly, so thank God for that. One day, one of the adults asked me to take food to the soldiers standing watch. Though my heart trembled inside. Remember, she's 5 years old, right? But everybody thinks she's a cute little girl. Have the cute little girl. Maybe they'll be nice to her. I forced a smile and handed the food to the soldiers. After I had done so several times, the soldiers' hearts softened. And one night, they set my family free. They instructed us to return to our hometown, and we walked out of their sight in that direction. But then, as we stood at the crossroads between life and death, night fell, and we waited, and heaven sent a young man to guide us on the path of life. Under the cover of darkness, we followed him across the 38th parallel, right? So they finally make it to freedom. Some young man, we don't know who he is, saved their lives. Amazing story, right? Probably none of us went through anything like that. I would assume that. So that's why we don't understand the mindset of Reverend Mrs. Moon and say, work every day for peace. Keep working for peace. Invite people for peace. Teach divine principle. Teach the Bible. Teach Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Teach. Don't give up. Because they've been through this. Because they grew up in this kind of nature. That's why they never give up. And that's why they never get tired. I get tired. This is Mrs. Moon when she was 16 years old. She said, our life in the South soon stabilized. I entered Hyochang Primary School, and in the free land in South Korea began going to school for the first time. I loved going to school with my bag of books every day. The older residents of the neighborhood would pat me on the head, and the neighborhood children also liked me very much. Korea, when I was there, is almost perfectly crime-free. There's no crime. In fact, I was really amazed. We would be driving through Korea, and it would get to be 10 o'clock at night, and all the mechanics' garages were open. And they were not there. I thought, that would never happen in California, believe me, in Los Angeles, right? And they left all their tools out. They didn't care. No one would steal them. And no one would steal from you or hit you. It's an amazing place. Anyhow, all the neighborhood would pat me on the head, and the neighborhood children also liked me very much. Looking back, I find it interesting that our rented room was close to Changpa-dong. That was the first church they built, by the way. The neighborhood in which 7 years later we would end our search for the Lord of the Second Advent. Until that day arrived, however, we endured many twists and turns on our odyssey. Unfortunately, it was early on a hot summer morning. Red balsam flowers blossomed on one side of our courtyard, and thick old willow and sycamore trees stood along the street. I was 7 years old now, but I remember the moment clearly as a frantic neighbor burst into our living room with the words, "War has broken out. The North Korean army has broken the line of defense across the 38th parallel." Right? So now they're terrified. North Koreans are coming, and they're killing everybody in their path, right? 2 days later, my mother woke up at dawn and began packing our clothes in a bundle. Let's see. Awakened by the rustling noise, I kept my eyes shut and listened to her conversation with my grandmother. "We have to seek refuge," my mother said. "After the communists get here, they'll kill us." "I know they are bad," my grandmother responded, "but do you think they would treat women harshly? If they find out we have escaped from the north," my mother reasoned, "they probably will kill us on the spot." So now they're terrified. They must escape the North Korean army. "Hurry!" he barked. This is her uncle. "We have to move them out." Uncle Soon Jung, based in the army headquarters as a military medic, was aware of the progress of the war. As soon as he heard that South Korean army was preparing to destroy the Han River Bridge, right? Han River goes through Seoul, Korea, and in order to get to the south, you have to cross the Han River. He requisitioned a truck and sped to our home. Knowing his family was in danger, he left the truck with its engine running in our foggy alley. We climbed in with our already packed bundle, and he drove toward the bridge. In the pre-dawn hours, crowds of refugees were swarming there from all directions, causing total chaos. As soon as we crossed the bridge, my uncle shouted, "Get down in your seats." As I squeezed down on the floor at my mother's feet, a huge explosion behind us shook our truck. There was a blue flash and a deafening sound. My uncle set the emergency brake and turned off the engine. Together we jumped out of the truck and climbed down the ditch at the side of the road. I turned my face to the bridge and witnessed the next explosion. I saw a light like a demon's burning eyes piercing the night. Countless civilians, as well as soldiers and policemen who were crossing the bridge, were thrown about like plastic toys flying everywhere, cast into the river below. A few meters had measured the distance between life and death. Our lives had been spared. Remember, she's 7 years old when this takes place. You can't, I'm sure, cannot imagine seeing that when you're 7 years old, right? It would mark you for the rest of your life, don't you think? The bombing of the Han Bridge took place at 3 a.m. on June 28, 1950. Even though the South Korean government had announced that it would defend Seoul, it blew up the only bridge leading to safety. Even before the North Korean People's Army came into the city, hundreds of people fleeing the city were killed. Amid this desperate crisis, through the help of my uncle, my life and the lives of my family were preserved. At that critical moment, God guided me and protected me from danger. She always believes she's been guided by God. She believes God is her father. Believe me, I do too. If you knew my life, you would think, yeah, God had to save you. Knucklehead. Thank you, God, for saving my life. This is what she says. I closed my eyes and many thoughts flashed across my mind. Why would anyone start a war? Why do innocent people die? Why is God permitting such pain and suffering? Who can bring an end to this madness? I could not conceive of any answers. When I reopened my eyes, I saw the bridge was cut in half. The military had accomplished its mission at the cost of hundreds of lives. What remained amid the corpses, the screaming wounded, and the dazed survivors was an ugly skeleton of steel smoldering in the dark. Right? And she says she never forgets that. Even today, there's new bridges across there, right? Now, and they built new bridges. But she says this: even today, whenever I cross a bridge over the Han River, I see the blue flash and hear people's agonized screams, echoing as if they are still burning in hell. My heart aches at the sound. At a young age, I directly witnessed the horror of war and experienced the wretched life of a refugee. The simple and innocent were killed like flies. Children who had lost their parents were crying and wandering in the streets. I was only 7, but it became so serious that war has to vanish forever from this world. It took place 70 years ago, but my throat still tightens when I recall the night on the Han River Bridge. So if you'd like to understand more, you can read her autobiography. It's called Mother of Peace, because having experiences the war, violence and killing and murder and torture and all those things that she's dedicated her life to create a world of peace, right? That's important because, again, if you've never seen war, then you might think, well, war, schmore, who knows what's going on in Ukraine? But she experienced it. So she says, I'll do anything to try and educate people to no longer have any war. So here's what she said: I burn with a youthful passion for saving humanity and building a peaceful world. Now, many people were in Korea, but they didn't begin newspapers, they didn't begin orphanages, they didn't build hospitals, they didn't do all those things. Somehow, Mrs. Moon did all those kinds of things. How could she do it? We think because she was guided directly by God. There are many good Christians in Seoul at the time, but they didn't do the things that she did. I'll show you some of the things that she did. Number one, they founded a church, and after years and years, they have church now, hundreds of thousands of members all over the world. Right? We are a little itty bitty church here, but we have churches all over the whole world. And so number one, the first thing they wanted to do was overcome worldwide communism through a program called KALSA. Right? The Washington Times was founded by Reverend Sun Myung Moon and Mrs. Hak Ja-han in 1982. The Times notes that Moon will forever be tied to the fight to defeat communism, a cause to which he devoted much of his life's work. So why is this? Because Reverend Moon himself was tortured by communists. His family was killed by communists. So they understand exactly what communism is and work to overcome communism, not by killing and fighting, but by education, by teaching ideology, by teaching you to wake up to what's going on in your world. Speaking of the fall of the Soviet Union, he said, I do not have the slightest doubt that God used the Washington Times to help bring an end to the most pernicious worldwide dictatorship in history and gave freedom to tens of millions of people, which we have no doubt that that actually really took place. The Times continued, as President Ronald Reagan often praised Reverend Moon's work at the Times, which especially in the 1980s focused extensively on communism and its attempted expansion around the world. Do you think communists like us? Do you think communist people like Reverend Moon? No, they hate our guts. So if you come to our church and hang around and then some people say how much they hate us, you can understand why. Reverend and Mrs. Moon were really important in overcoming the Soviet Union freeing countries. Ronald Reagan thanked Reverend Moon through Bohi Pak. When Reagan's term was almost over, he invited me to the president and publisher of the Washington Times to the Oval Office in the White House. As seen in this picture, he firmly shook my hand in appreciation and said, Dr. Pak, no one appreciates the value of the Washington Times more than I. Without the Washington Times, my Reagan doctrine would have been a failure. It could not have triumphed over the president's doctrine. Would you kindly convey my deep thanks and appreciation to Reverend Moon, the founder of Washington Times, who made the most precious investment for freedom. Right? Many countries, many Eastern European countries are now free, and many of them are living in the United States, free to travel. Millions of Polish people thank Ronald Reagan and Reverend Moon. You saved our lives, and John Paul II. They fought without killing anybody. They freed Poland, Hungary, Romania, Belarus, many other countries, right? They're all free from communism now, free to travel, free to go around the world, free to come to the United States, free to start businesses. They're now becoming very wealthy countries, right? East Germany is now free. East Germans were trapped by communism for many years. So this is Mrs. Moon. Although Mrs. Moon's life began in unbelievable hardship, racial discrimination, war and famine, her life has been a tremendous victory in the name of peace and love. Isn't that amazing? What a story. All kinds of Koreans went through that hell but didn't create newspapers and businesses and didn't marry millions of people. We say love is greater than truth. That's why the misuse of love condemns people to a life without God. So we believe it's really important, especially young people, that you understand adultery will hurt you. Adultery and fornication will hurt you. So what do? Do we attack people who commit adultery? No, absolutely not. What we try to do is educate people to create good families of loving husbands, loving wives that can love each other and remain married for the rest of their life and raise beautiful children. That's our whole goal, is raising beautiful children, right? On the other hand, pardon me. On the other hand, love is greater than the law. Let's say you committed a sin, and for that sin you should be condemned. What do we find? That love is greater than the law. The love of Jesus Christ allows you to be forgiven for your sin. And we say, and above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. We invite people back into God's kingdom of heaven. So what we do is we do this worldwide marriage blessing and education festival. We teach people about what we call true family values, marriage values, values of love, value of husband, value of wife, and then we do these blessing programs. This one was in Sweden, and this is a worldwide program. This was in Cambodia, where 700 couples remarry and get married and then pledge to God they'll love each other, take care of their husbands and wives. This one's in Africa, where tens of thousands of African people. Again, we're utterly interracial. We love everybody. We think that marriage blessing helps every single person in the world. This is in San Diego. And she does these Rally of Hope programs where she brings leaders from all around the world, religious leaders, to overcome their religious hatred of each other, to love each other and work together for peace. So we have Buddhists, we have Anglicans, we have Christians, we have women, we have Taoists, we try to bring them together so that religious people can actually love each other, talk to each other, become friends, and understand we're all on the same path, the path towards peace. Isn't that amazing? You know anybody else doing this? I don't know anybody else doing this. We bring all kinds of Christians and religious leaders together to pray, to work hard. We have schools in Africa. Africa is probably the poorest continent on earth. So Mrs. Moon made many schools in Africa, all these different schools in different countries, Equatorial Guinea, Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, different schools, vocational schools, and we support those schools through donations. And because how do you tell a woman to have equal rights but you don't give her an education? Women need to have an education. We also have Sun Moon University, different theological seminaries. We do prayer rallies of politicians. Mike Pence, Jonathan Falwell is a big Reverend Giant Church in America. Young Hwan Kim, Christian Council of Korea. So we try to bring people together to pray for peace and discuss peace. How do you stand up for peace in the world? See? This is the Intercontinental 1 Million Prayers for Peace rally with Hindus and Christians and all kinds of people. You wouldn't think Hindus and Christians would come together to pray for peace, right? You think, well, Hindus, Christians, they don't have the same God. But yes, we do be able to bring these people together to pray and work for peace, to discuss our differences, but more importantly, to discuss what we have in common. And you know what we've discovered we have in common? What do Hindus have in common with Christians? Christians have in common with Muslims. Muslims have in common with Sub-Saharan Africans. Sub-Saharan Africans we all have family in common. Every single human was born of a mother and father. Every single one born of a mother and father. All parents want their children to do well, want their children to be loved, want their children to be educated, right? So we teach true family values in our marriage blessing ceremony. Here's the president of Albania, president of Libya, Secretary Ban Ki-moon of United Nations, Hak Jahan, of course, President Sen of Cambodia. So many presidents, politicians, get them together to come together and pray and talk about peace. Amen? Amen. I hope this is a brief introduction. I hope you appreciated it and learned something. Get her book. Read it. You'll be impressed and you'll be really amazed. Yes?
I am reading